Grady Powell, host of Forged in Fire.
Kyle Mann.
I'm J. Warner Wallace.
Kira Davis.
It's Ben Adams.
Hey, this is Dave Baker.
Carrie Pomeroli.
This is Mike Reiner.
This is Ethan Nicole.
This is Liam Morgan.
This is Graham Parker, the 5th GP, and this is why you should never.
How I got suckered in.
I'm so embarrassed that I'm here.
You're wasting your time. You got better things to do.
Never listen.
Those darling, yummy Reverend and the Reprobate.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Reverend and the Reprobate Show. I am Lucas Pinkert, an actual Reverend, and here with me is a man who just barely made it this afternoon. It is the big man, Dan Gibson. What's going on, the Reprobate?
Nothing much, man. What's going on with you?
I'm so happy that you made it.
Yeah, I just barely did.
Yeah.
In fact, I literally was just working on, I was on a work call,
right,
and walked in, hung up, and then sat down. And heard you guys talking about some of the wonderful things you were talking about.
Yes.
And was just so intrigued.
And you'll notice at the beginning of this interview, depending on how we edit it, maybe there will be a cardboard cutout of Dan. Maybe not. Maybe not.
Let's go for it.
There'll be an empty chair because Dan does join us about a third of the way through the interview today of the incredibly brilliant Dr. Carl Trueman, the author of the two books that are here in front of us, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, as well as Strange New World. Dr. Trueman is a professor at Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania and one of the most influential intellectuals today. I put him in the same category that I would Piercy and Peterson and Schaefer and all of those guys. Dr. Trueman,
we really missed out. The
On
only question we didn't get to ask him was about G.K. Chesterton.
We'll have to bring him back on. He offered to come back on our show.
Yeah.
We didn't ask him to come back. We thanked him for his time, and he went, "This was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Anytime you guys have something of mine you want to talk about, bring me back on." And we will be more than happy to oblige. Yeah, more than happy to oblige. Dr. Carl Trueman talks to us about the Romantic poets and the philosophy behind them that were the basis and foundation of what eventually becomes Marxism. Whether or not Marx or Nietzsche is really the true brilliant star in the philosophical world today. Whether or not a person can be a Marxist and a Christian, and what member of Monty Python actually influenced him to go down the road that he went on intellectually so that he would end up finding, I guess, his quote-unquote true calling and become an educator. Yeah. Yeah, there you go. All that and more in this wonderful episode. Thank you guys for watching. Make sure that you like, subscribe, ding the little bell to get notifications. Do us a big favor. Tell your friends about this episode. We really, we joke around a lot, but I actually believe that this episode that we have is one of the most probably culturally important episodes that we've done. Right, and we unrelated.
I ask the fewest questions and say the
least. as is typically the case with our show, we and we were discussing this just a second ago because we are not afraid to look foolish. I think we get some of the most interesting content out of Dr. Trueman that I've seen or heard, which has little to do with us and a lot to do with the brilliance of the guy that we're getting to interview. So, without any further ado.
Brilliance Extraction. Rev and Rep team. Go.
Dr. Carl Trueman.
Yeah.
While Danley's on his way, I want to introduce to you guys one of the people that I believe is probably up in the upper echelon of important intellectuals, especially as it comes to social commentary, alongside the names of Schaefer, Piercy, Peterson. I think you need to add to your list Carl Trueman. He's the author of The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, as well as the condensed version of it that makes it a little bit easier to go through and maybe a little bit more intellectually available. Strange New World. It is the man, the myth, the legend himself, Dr. Carl Trueman. How are you, Doc?
I'm doing very well. That's far too kind an introduction.
Well, I'm
delighted to be here.
Well, thanks for being on the show. I really do think that it's true. As I was doing some research over the past couple of years, I'm a pastor at a church here just north of Dallas in North Texas, and we have entered into this new sort of cultural norm where especially we see the sexual revolution has now taken on its possibly what we hope might be its logical conclusion, but who knows how much further they can press it past where it's at already. And so as we were discussing in our pastoral world, like what are the things that we should be looking at, that we should be reading, we really discovered the importance of breaking down the worldviews and the philosophies that were behind a lot of the movements that we're encountering. And you do a brilliant job of that in your book, really taking it all the way back pre-Enlightenment or around that area to the Romantics and that sort of thing, going back to Rousseau. But as you say in the intro to The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, that what you originally set out to do was to kind of make a contemporary interpretation of the works of Philip Rieff. So talk to me a little bit about him and why you think he's such an important character in history.
Yeah, the original plan was to do, you may be familiar with James K.A. Smith's little book, How Not to Be Secular, his kind of summary of Charles Taylor's thinking. And I was approached by Crossway and by Rod Dreher, a friend of mine who's a conservative journalist. And both of them wanted me to do this sort of summary of Philip Rieff. Well, as I was working on Rieff, it became clear to me that a more interesting approach would be to apply Rieff to modern culture and modern society. Well, who is Rieff? Rieff was a great Freudian scholar of the latter half of the 20th century, and he used some Freudian ideas to critique society. And at the center of Rieff's program was his belief that a new kind of self, a new sort of way of understanding humanity had emerged in the last century and a half, what he called the therapeutic self, which saw society really as being there to serve, we might say, my felt needs, rather than seeing the individual as somebody who had to be trained to become a contributing member of society. The basic idea was that really society is there to contribute to me, to make me feel good. So Rieff, I think, was significant for me on that front. Beginning to realize, this actually takes us to the heart of not just the sexual revolution, but also the gender crisis we're facing, and also many things that mark, my own life. I'm a conservative Christian, but I'm not separate from this therapeutic society, and it enabled me to do a lot of heart searching myself. So that was where I think Rieff was important, this notion of the therapeutic self.
So as you trace back the notion of the therapeutic self, you end up, and in my own life, I can say this, you've ended up stepping on the toes of some of my heroes of culture throughout the past, namely the Romantic poets. Now, I think a lot of people, especially in Christian circles, we look at the Romantic poets and we think of that as kind of the height of art, that they were the ones that really got it, that really understood it. And you do a great job of pulling back the curtain on what the philosophy was that was behind them, namely their interest in a guy named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. What do you believe was I guess the thing about Rousseau that made them so attracted to him?
Well, I think certain aspects of Rousseau capture important aspects of truth. I think one of the things that the Romantics draw on Rousseau for is that the notion that human beings we're not purely rational. We're not simply driven by reason. We're also driven by, what, for want of a better term, is emotional intuitions. We feel things. You can sense this yourself when I often use the example in the classroom. I say to students, if you look out of the window and see an old lady being beaten up by a gang of youths and you don't feel that that's wrong, if you have to Google to see what do I do when I see an old lady being beaten up, or you have to go through a logical process to work out what you need to do, we'd say there's something wrong with you. You need to feel something. What the Romantics find in Rousseau is this idea that actually we need to get reconnected to our intuitions. Now, those intuitions are perverted and twisted, but for Rousseau, they're perverted and twisted by the twisted and perverted society in which we live. We're not isolated individuals. We're parts of communities where there's competitions, there's envy, there's jealousy, there's one-upmanship. There are all these things that twist our natural feelings. And what Rousseau and then the Romantics after him were really arguing was we need to go back and reconnect with our pristine nature in order to reconnect with these original intuitions. And for the Romantics, the way to do that was for many of them to go back to the rural way of life. Wordsworth sees going back to a rural way of life as a way of reconnecting with the real self. And of course, if you live in the city and you can't go back to a rural environment, what do? You read poems about rural folk and rural environments. You look at paintings that capture the tremendous beauty and power of nature. This is a way of reconnecting yourself with nature. And all of this plays into the modern story I'm telling by granting an increasing authority, you might say, to inner feelings. My inner feelings start to become more and more important for who I am. And my ability to express those feelings outwardly becomes more and more important to my authenticity.
I'm by no means would I consider myself a scholar in any of these realms, but I did in college became fascinated with, in particular, William Blake and Wordsworth, because they were always presented in any of the British literature classes that I took as people that had fundamental Christian beliefs and backgrounds, particularly Blake, that's where it started. And both of these guys, they say, were heavily influenced by Milton, particularly Paradise Lost, and that they came from this sort of church background. And I think for a lot of Christians, that's why we make that connection, is these are the last group of poets that were able to do that. But you have really articulated well in both of these volumes that the overarching influence was not the church, is that they were being pushed further and further by these ideas from Rousseau, and that because of that those men with the influence that they have made the next jump that we see into things like Marxism and that kind of thing that much easier because they wrote so beautifully. You seem to take a different tack when you're talking particularly about one of their contemporaries, P.B. Shelley. That Shelley, and I don't know if you would attribute a lot of this to his wife and his in-laws, but with Godwin Wollstonecraft and his wife Mary Shelley, that there is a lot of influence that pushes him even further to the brink. What do you think was so different about P.B. Shelley that we didn't see in Wordsworth and Blake in particular?
Yeah, well, I think Wordsworth and Blake, in some ways, Wordsworth and Blake are very different. And Blake's form of Christianity is a very weird form of Christianity.
Oh, no doubt,
He's interested in plural marriage and all kinds of strange stuff. He's more of a mystic, I think, than a Christian.
Or maybe he belongs in Utah.
Sorry?
I said maybe he belongs in Utah.
He would fit. He would have fit. I think he'd have found the authority structure a bit restrictive.
Yeah, probably.
But he would certainly have had certain similarities with certain of those people who live in Colorado City and places like that. But when you come to Shelley, I think if I were to look at the difference between Wordsworth and Shelley, well, first of all, Wordsworth becomes more conservative in later life. He's one of those guys who greets the French Revolution with great enthusiasm and then reacts against it in later life. Shelley doesn't live long enough to become a conservative reactionary. But I think what's interesting about Shelley is there's a sense in which his romanticism, as far as I read him, is always forward-looking. There's a nostalgia in Wordsworth romanticism. He wants to go back to the rural way of life. Shelley wants to go forward to the utopia. If you read his poem Queen Mab, when Shelley goes on this spectacular psychedelic coach ride into the future with the Queen of the Fairies, and sees this vision of society in the future, there's a forward-looking dimension to Shelley that he really wants to see what we would now say is a kind of social revolution taking place. It's not a question of going back to a rural idyll for Shelley. It's a question of moving forward to a radically egalitarian society. So he's much more iconoclastic on that front than a Wordsworth would be.
So where does Lord Byron fit into all of this? Because it seems like while the rest of these guys are, pontificating and trying to push society in one way, he's just excited to womanize in the carriage.
Yeah, I think there is an element of Byron that is just having a good time. I mean, mad, bad, and dangerous to know. The famous romantic painting of Byron at Shelley's, Shelley drowns and he's cremated on the beach in Italy, and Byron is standing there with Trelawney. In reality, Byron couldn't even be bothered to get out of his coach to sort of go and see what was happening. And there is a legend that he went back later and retrieved Shelley's skull so that he could drink his claret from it at night. That's always struck me as a very romantic. Wow. It's kind of, on the one hand, rather sick, but on the other hand, rather cool sort of romantic gesture. But I think Byron was, by and large, he was the nearest thing to a rock star, I guess, that the Romantics produced, and I think he was in it for the same reason many rock stars are. poetry was one thing, but the notoriety, the money, and the women it brought him were probably the primary motivations.
Well, that's good to hear. It's good to know that the largest of the Romantic Poets volumes that I keep on my shelf is the one that's least likely to lead me astray. So that's good to hear. Now, as the things that were taught during the Romantic era, or the ideas and things that came out of that, enter into the more modern area, we see the rise of people like Karl Marx, and you do a phenomenal job of looking specifically at his threefold dogma for Marxism, which starts with the elimination of any kind of higher power, because that's just something that's given to sort of the proletarians as sort of an opiate. So my question is, and I'm going to butcher this name. Do you say it Nietzsche or Nietzsche?
Nietzsche works.
Okay, yeah, perfect. So neither. I just all the way suck at this. So anyway, so as you look at those two guys, they have sort of seen this resurgence in popularity amongst the universities, particularly in the United States. Do you think that it is congruent for a person to say that they are both a Christian and a Marxist? Can you be both?
Well, if somebody said that to me, I'd want to ask them exactly what they mean. We need to get some clarification, because sometimes for some people, Marxism means nothing more than wanting a square deal for the little guy, for some, or wanting to see social justice. And then I think you've got to drill down into, okay, so what do you mean by Marxism? Why is it attractive? How are you using these terms? Strictly speaking, I think it's impossible to be a theist and a Marxist. Marx takes it as basic. He never argues for the non-existence of God. He assumes that. The non-existence of God is an absolute assumption for Marx. And that's why religion fascinates him, because, hey, the Enlightenment philosophers have more than adequately disposed of God. So why do people keep believing it? What is it that makes this belief persist? So if you want to be, strictly speaking, to say you're a Christian Marxist, I think is nonsense. Now, having said that, you might be a Christian whose thinking is shaped or flavored a little bit by certain Marxist ideas. I don't see any problem, for example, in being a Christian and thinking that class is a very, very important way for understanding what's going on in society and some of the struggles we see before us. Well, class it's kind of a Marxist idea, but I think you can be interested in class. You can read Marx on class and get insights there without having to buy into being a Marxist. So it all comes down really to how you're using that term.
So do you think? And by the way, hi, I'm Dan.
Good to see you, Dan. Glad you got through the traffic.
Oh yeah, I'm the reprobate, and I'm on my way to being a reverend. I'm getting closer. But I am curious. So we're talking about Marxism and the view of it, which has become pretty popular, especially with the younger generation. I'm curious. Do you think that any of them have actually read the Communist Manifesto, or is it something they're just repeating from, friends?
If they've read anything at all, it's probably the Communist Manifesto, which is if you haven't read it, it's a powerful piece of rhetoric. Nobody becomes. I joke with the students. Nobody becomes a communist because they read Das Kapital. In 2018, I reviewed a number of biographies of Marx for the Modern Reformation magazine, and in one of them, they got a list of great Marxist leaders, and it showed how far they'd read in Das Kapital. And I think Fidel Castro had only got to about page 128 or something like that. So the theoretical tomes of economic Marxism are not the things that set people's minds on fire, or ever have done. So if they've read anything at all, it's likely to be the Communist Manifesto. What's interesting, of course, is that Marxism has developed as a tradition significantly since Marx. Marxists themselves, Leninists fight Trotskyists, fight Stalinists. There are all kinds of debates within Marxism itself. I think, by and large, when young people today use the language of Marxism, they've grabbed hold of a couple of ideas. Maybe they've read something somewhere online. I doubt very much that they've wrestled with the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, for example. They probably haven't read the German ideology, which is the interesting Marx stuff to me. More likely, they've read stuff that's been produced by Marxist magazines online or something like that. I don't see I was being badgered by, I think, the Queer Socialists of America or something at some point. I was getting these emails from them. It's kind of, I'm sure they're like 5 people or something like that. I felt terribly threatened by these. But I remember forwarding one of these emails to a friend at Notre Dame and saying, I remember in the 80s, I used to have my supervisor was a Marxist. I used to have discussions with serious Marxists. These people are not serious Marxists. They're clowns using Marxist language. And I think that captures an awful lot of what's going on at the moment.
How do you go ahead?
I just think that's a very good sentence.
They're clowns using Marxist language.
It's kind of the title of our times. It seems
Yeah.
like, at least at times.
Yeah, for sure. So
I'm the opposite. I'm a clown using
what?
Nickelodeon language.
Nickelodeon language. Well done. You're a big Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles fan, so that seems to fit. So as one of the things you outline in the book is that sort of what freed Marxism to kind of take a foothold is the naturalist and the naturalistic science philosophies and the things that came along with Darwin, because now there's a reason to disconnect religion. Whereas the Enlightenment did away with it. Darwin, as others would say, effectively gave us an explanation that was other than God in the viewpoint of those philosophers. Why are those two things taught on the university level, Marxism or some type of socialism, and the naturalistic scientific philosophy? Why are those two things so dangerous for culture today?
Well, I think on the scientism front, the problem with scientism is it simply can't answer some of the most important questions of human existence. And you see this stemming from the Enlightenment. I gave a quiz this morning in class, and at the end of each of my quizzes, there's always a slightly tongue-in-cheek question. And the question was, true or false? Frank Sinatra sang a lot of songs about epistemology. And the answer is false, of course, but the serious point I'm trying to make is Frank Sinatra sings about love and desire, because these are the things that are important. Science has done so many incredible things, and it's scored so many great victories and victories for good in the history of humanity, that it's come to have a sort of power beyond its sphere. And I would say the problem with scientism as such is, think about the COVID crisis. I never saw a moral philosopher being interviewed on the TV. The experts were always medical experts. And I remember having a discussion in class once saying to the students, it's interesting that a medical expert, a doctor can tell you, a scientist can tell you how to save a life, but he can't explain to you why that life is worth saving. He can only give a technical answer, because he just looks at the world through a technical lens. So I think that the problem with the strong tilt towards natural sciences is not that natural sciences are bad. It's that they can become the all-consuming way of looking at existence. And that means that I would say the most important questions of human existence: what do we love? Who do we love? How do we love? What do we hate? Why do we get out of bed in the morning? These things get bracketed out as things that we simply can't talk about. On the Marxist front, I think that on one level, Marx has touched so many disciplines precisely because he raises interesting questions, and the tradition of Marxism offers ways of approaching and answering those questions. On the other hand, of course, Marxism as a practical political philosophy has led to catastrophic numbers of people slaughtered, far more than Nazism, and yet we don't have Nazism being promoted as an ideology in higher education. I think the answer then becomes, Marxism has this rhetoric that is inherently attractive. The rhetoric of Nazism, the rhetoric of the master race and of sending Jews to concentration camps, that's self-evidently evil. But Marxism has this rhetoric of wanting justice, wanting a fair deal for the ordinary guy, wanting to get rid of oppression. That's inherently attractive, and I think that draws people in, and it makes particularly young people easy prey. Those people who are peddling this in classrooms find a ready-made audience, because young people can look at the world, they see there's injustice, they see there's racism, they see there are problems out there, and Marxism seems to provide a very nice rhetorically attractive scheme for addressing these things.
I do love the way that you end your book, because you, especially The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, is you get so in detail about all of these different things, and you end your book by saying, this book brings up a lot of questions which I'm not going to answer, and that's for you to wrestle with. And as much as I was anticipating the ending where you give us like, all right, here's the 30 seconds, here's how we fix it, you sort of throw the ball back into the court of the reader and tell us to do that. Why was that such an important way for you to end your book, is to put the onus back on the reader?
Well, a number of reasons. One, I think it's a question of competence. I'm a historian. And therefore I help explain why the present looks the way it does, but I'm not quite sure how to move forward. So I'm no more competent than the next man or woman to advocate on the front. Secondly, I think there may not be a one-size-fits-all answer to this. I think the answer may look different in different communities. I live in rural Western Pennsylvania. The problems present themselves differently here to the way they do in Manhattan or north of Dallas. And it may well be that we have to wrestle with these problems at a local level. We have to take the big picture, but then think, well, how does this apply at my local level? How do I address it at a local level? And thirdly, the book was already 420 pages. Nobody wants to hear another 400 pages from me at that point. So there was also the, wow, I'm tired of writing this book at this point. I need to get out while I still can.
I've never tried to write a book, but I can only imagine.
I have endeavored to read his several times, and it's full of highlighter marks. I went all the way through it, and then I started reading it out loud, and my wife goes, please shut up, I'm trying to sleep. She was like going and Googling every other word that we have. Well, Dr. Trueman, we appreciate the time. We end all of our interviews with a segment we call Controlled Rowdiness, which are just some rapid fire questions which you can answer with as lengthy or as quick a response as you want to. Expect nothing from us by way of reply or response. There are no right answers, but there are several wrong ones, so be careful not to step on those landmines. We're going to give you two quick ones. We want to be respectful of your time, and Big Dan will let you get started.
All right. Well, Dr. Carl Trueman, I've got one question. Shake one hand, hug one, and debate one. Karl Marx, Nietzsche, and Winston Churchill. What would you choose?
I'll shake Churchill's hand. I'm not a big hugger, being English,
right.
But I'd probably hug Marx, but then check my pockets afterwards to make sure he hadn't taken anything. And excellent. I'd love to debate Nietzsche, because I think he's the man. My own view is, if we wanted to boil the world down to two viewpoints, it's Christianity or Nietzsche. So I think Nietzsche, as the most serious opponent, would be the one to debate.
Wow. I just think arguing with Winston Churchill would be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But you answered perfectly.
I mean, in a way, it was a no. I could have done any three with any of them. There'd be three fun guys to meet and spend half an hour with.
I do agree giving a hug to Marx. I think he needs it the most.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Probably.
The hair, the facial hair might make me itch, but I'm sure I could cope.
That's okay. So in your book, you mention some famous quotes. You've got Descartes' "I think, therefore I am," Nietzsche's "God is dead." I noticed that there was a big one that was missing from a philosopher named Idle, who said, I'm a lumberjack and I'm okay. I sleep all night and I work all day. I chop down trees. I press wildflowers. I dress in women's clothing and hang around in bars. Why didn't you put Mr. Idle among these other just icons of the transgender philosophy and ideology?
I think that is a real omission. And there is actually an odd connection between myself and Monty Python, believe it or not. I was inspired to become an academic and a writer through a lecture I heard Terry Jones give when I was at high school. He came to a local high school, and all the high schools gathered together. And Terry Jones, as well as being a great comedian, was also an expert on Geoffrey Chaucer. And he lectured on The Knight's Tale. And I came away from that lecture thinking, I want to be like that guy.
Wow.
I want to be a comedian and an academic. I want to try to combine the two. I want to be cheerful and thoughtful. So Terry Jones, huge inspiration. You're right. It's a real. If ever I do a second edition, I need to work Monty Python in as a homage to those guys.
Yeah.
Also, what good luck.
Yeah.
Catching Terry Jones.
Of all of them, to catch Terry Jones.
Talking about knighthood and the stories of that led to the Holy Grail.
The second volume of The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self will just have a man with suspenders and a bra with an axe.
And a coconut.
And a coconut. There we go.
Maybe I should include the Philosopher's Song as well, of course.
That would be so fantastic. And a dead parrot and all the classics. Well, Dr. Trueman, thank you so much. You got one more?
We can't forget the Spanish Inquisition.
That's true.
But this is
I
not
didn't
a show.
expect that. I did not expect that.
Fantastically done. Dr. Trueman, thanks so much for the time. We appreciate it, bud.
Thanks for having me on.
Carl freaking Trueman.
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, it's been an interview in the making for most of our show.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't long
I shouldn't
after.
say most, but it was
Yeah, I mean,
half.
at this, which is most.
There you go. Still correcting me.
Like you said, we've literally been working on most of the time that we've been doing this show. Like, he has been one of these that we've earmarked way early on. Mm-hmm. And in
fact, I had someone ask me today, how did you guys get him? I was like, we've been asking
tenacity.
for
Tenacity is how we got him.
Yeah.
You know,
for over a year.
Yeah, because
he's in demand and he's smart and he's worthy and
and when people are saying like, oh well, check back in March, then we do the check back in March. We set alerts in Trello and in other things to make sure that we're checking back and that we're consistently following up. And finally, like you said, after 14 or 15 months, here he was on the show, and just as wonderful and charming as awesome. I wanted him to be.
We had talked ahead of time about joking about Monty Python.
And I butchered the lumberjack line. Ugh.
It was close enough.
It was
not.
It was
Tildy.
It was. I got so close that as I started to say it, I started in the wrong point for where I have rehearsed the question in my mind all day. And I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I didn't hang around in bars. Please save me, Mr. Trueman. And he did.
He knew it.
He did.
In fact, he had some good things to say about him.
Especially the
Spanish
Jones
Inquisition.
Who knew that? What other podcast I was inspired to do what I'm doing because of Terry Jones out of Dr. Carl Trueman?
If we were to rank,
nobody did.
If we were to rank,
which ones?
You're right. If we were to rank all of the reasons to live in England,
yes,
what number does the chance of running into Monty Python working at an intellectual college?
10. It's top 10.
I agree.
Yeah, it's absolutely top 10. And he met Terry Jones in high school talking about Geoffrey Chaucer. If Terry Jones would have come to my high school and talked about Geoffrey Chaucer, I'd have probably read more of it. Mm-hmm. Like, I'd have been a lot more interested. Then A Knight's Tale to me would not just be Heath Ledger and Paul Bettany. It would have been whatever Chaucer wanted it to actually be.
But also, I was really dumb in high school. I'm like, this is a spare guy up here talking about.
If Terry Jones came up there, you would not have thought it was a spare guy when we were in high school.
It would have depended on when, but high school, absolutely not. I would have loved it.
Yeah, we would. If
there was a period in my life that I didn't appreciate Monty Python, high school was not one of them.
No, it certainly wasn't.
I agree.
And thanks, Terry Jones. Thanks, Terry Jones, for inspiring Dr. Carl Trueman. I did so prior to you getting here, I did talk to him a little bit about the way that he has examined and peeled back the curtain on the philosophy of the Romantic poets, which I think, and especially because both of us were homeschooled for a period of time, right? I think we were always kind of shown the Romantic poets and told like, these are the good guys. Like, poetry.
Are they?
Poetry is not as beautiful before or since the Romantic poets. They're the ones that got it right. And Trueman's like,
yeah,
sort of. They sort of got it right.
It was funny when I walked in and I heard the conversation about poetry, and I went, oh.
You were like, I wish I was back in traffic. I hurried through traffic to get to this crap.
Yeah, no, it was like, I'm not going to have a lot to say about this. And then Monty Python came in. Oh, great.
Yeah, for sure.
And I'm glad I stuck it out.
Yeah, and you got some great questions answered about Karl Marx.
Yeah, because smart people like poems too.
Yeah.
They're probably the only people who like poems.
Maybe. And I do love, I think you were on whenever he talked about Lord Byron, because he mentions Byron in the book, but just that Byron was part of the Romantic poets. Like, he goes after Blake and Wordsworth, and he really goes after her, after Percy Bysshe Shelley.
It is funny. He's going after poets who have been dead a long time.
He really goes after them philosophically. In a way that shows, especially people that have been told, like, oh, this is the height of literature.
I get it. It's just funny to think about it.
And then you talk to him about Lord Byron, and he's like, nah, I think he was just in it for the chicks. It's one of those things that you, like, when you think about all of the cool bands that we played with whenever we were growing up,
the Goo Dolls.
Yeah, like then Disciple, and I'm trying to think the guys that are now, they were Bliss, they're now the Afters, getting to be on the, and then, on the same stage with Switchfoot and some of these other guys. I feel we never got to play with Metallica. But I feel like there's like this list of all of these like incredible bands that we played with. And then like at the bottom, it says also there, Lucas and Danley. Yeah. They're like, that's sort of where Lord Byron is. Like, here's all of these influential people also there. Lord Byron, who may or may not have drank out of Percy Shelley's skull.
Yeah.
It's cool. Now I kind of want to make.
Never know.
I kind of want to make a PB Shelley skull mug and send that to him for whatever, I'm sure he drinks breakfast tea with his hobnobs. You think he does chocolate hobnobs, or do you think he goes just bare?
Chocolate hobgoblin.
Chocolate hobnobs, drinking out of skulls, and
hugging,
and the clowns that emailed me the Dr. Carl Trueman episode. So we super thankful for Dr. Trueman for making the time, for Lauren, his agent, for working us in,
and not only being smart but
awesome.
being funny too.
Yeah. And he, if you read the books, he's definitely combined those things. Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self is definitely the more in-depth look, whereas Strange New World is one that is not only a little bit more intellectually available if you don't want to get into the deep dive, but has also got study questions in there. So if you read it with a book club, or if you are a group of pastors that want to read it, people that are studying philosophy or a Bible study, it's stellar to be able to use. The questions are very easy to not just answer, but also to create conversation that will help you not only understand everything that he's putting forth in the book, but also to give you a little bit of a foothold into doing some cultural apologetics. Man, I could go on and on about how much I got out of that half hour.
Yeah, you could just go on and on about
it. But at this point, with all of our bad math and everything else...
Are pretty close math, which actually is not a thing. Because
this has been an episode, Tilde, of the Reverend and the Reprobate. Yeah. You guys have a good give, and we'll see you next week.
My name's Carl Trueman. I'm a professor at Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania, and you should never listen to the Reverend and Reprobate, because that will be 25 minutes of your life you will never get back.